This second session is about regional integration paradigm and regional trade. And to talk about its impact on tariff, pricing of transmission assets, and the use of marginal locational prices is the chairperson of the Electricity Authority of New Zealand, Dr. Brent Layton. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the Energy Regulatory Commission of Thailand for inviting me along to this forum today. I much appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the interactions that will occur. I certainly found this morning very interesting, and a number of the things I will talk about today and again at the capacity meeting tomorrow actually fit in quite closely, particularly with the work that you are engaged in this region on the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore interchange. New Zealand is geographically separated from other countries by quite a distance. People think that we are close to Australia, and they are our closest neighbour, but we are still 3.5 hours flying time from the east coast of Australia further to the east. So for good economic and technical reasons, New Zealand actually has an electricity system that serves only the New Zealand economy. The country is long and thin and has 2 main islands. And there are very significant regional imbalances between generation and consumption, and between those 2 islands, and indeed within those islands, not just in terms of the volumes of production and consumption, but also the fuel mix between them. In 2014, the last year for which there's comprehensive data, 63.1% of New Zealand's 42.2 terawatt hours, or 42,200 gigawatt hours of electricity, was consumed in the North Island, but only 55.7% was produced there. In the South Island, the balance is around the other way, 36.9% of consumption, but 44.3% of production. In the North Island, the mix of fuels is made up of geothermal, located largely in the centre of the North Island. Other sizable contributions come from gas. New Zealand has its own gas fields. It doesn't import or export gas, but those gas fields are restricted to the western side and offshore to the west of the North Island of New Zealand. There is no gas fields in the south or in other regions. And in the North Island, there's also significant contributions from hydro, mainly one river system that runs from the centre of the North Island to just south of Auckland, which has a chain of hydro power stations on it. Less significant contributions come from coal and from wind in the North Island. In the South Island, the fuel mix is largely hydro. In fact, virtually all of the South Island's generation is hydroelectric power, with a little bit of wind. The other small contributions in New Zealand, we have some biomass, a very little solar, and then a range of other sources such as methane taken out of rubbish dumps and used to run power stations and so forth. And there's a number of power plants that are operated in conjunction with wood processing that run on the wood waste that is being used there. We have a high dependence on renewables. In fact, in the last quarter, 84% of all of New Zealand's electricity was generated by one form of renewable or another. And one of the characteristics of renewables is that they tend to be very tied to where the resource is based, where the wind blows or the hydro power station can be built, or indeed if the geothermal activity is present so that you can build in them. As a result of that, we have a wide disparity of sources in the different islands and from where the population is. A third of New Zealand's population lives in Auckland, which is almost near the top of the North Island. So the situation isn't actually too different than it is in the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore area. Long and skinny, hydro at one end, gas differently located. We have geothermal elsewhere located, and even the wind is in specific locations. And so we have two AC grids that are linked by an HVDC interconnector. In fact, there are two poles to that interconnector. And we've had an HVDC link since the mid-1960s. It was one of the very first ever built. That equipment has been recently replaced, and we now have two poles, one of which was built in the 1990s, and the other of which was built quite recently, in fact, finished in 2014. And they link that flow. The flow is very important to us because in most of the time we need the hydro resource to generate electricity in the south to flow to the population centres around Auckland and to the north. But when we have dry weather, and New Zealand doesn't have large storage in its hydro, we need the flow to be able to go in the opposite direction because we have drought conditions in the south and they need the security of supply. And looking at the chart that was put up in relation to LTMS, where one saw excess capacity in all of the markets that were analysed, those four, particularly in Singapore, but also in all of the others having capacity significantly above their peak demand. One of the obvious economic benefits of integrating those markets that one can see as a New Zealander, given what we do, is the ability to in fact share the reserve capacity among those four markets. So you'd be able to sustain significant growths in overall demand without building much extra generation. The savings from that reduction in capital investment will be very significant if you can achieve it through the operation of a market. We have to have a number of things if you want to integrate using a market across a grid: diverse consumers, diverse producers, and diverse energy sources and fuel sources. And three of the really important requirements are rules that determine what generators will be run and how much each will be run for at every point in time to meet that demand, rules about what the generators at various locations will be paid, and what the consumers at the various locations will actually be charged. And then you need rules setting out from whom and how the costs of the grid linking the regionally dispersed consumers and producers will be recovered. They need to be satisfied even in a market like New Zealand, which is inside one political area, but they of course have to be satisfied even if you are across multiple, as the LTMS market is going to be, and as that expands even further on. So those issues are there. The challenges are somewhat similar that we've faced, but probably a bit more acute when you're dealing across boundaries. Although one interesting feature about the New Zealand market is it started in 1996, and it started without any regulatory intervention whatsoever and was done entirely on the basis of multilateral contracts. And there was no regulator and no overall governance arrangement for that market until 2003. It was done by the parties, buyers and sellers, agreeing in a multilateral contractual form without regulatory intervention. So it's very multilateral, like what you're trying to do with your Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore interchange. So as I said, we've had a market since 1996, and how does that work? How do we match demand and supply? Well, generators, and that includes, in our case, dispatchable demand, who are treated just like negative generators. They offer to be cut off rather than offer to put electricity into the system, make offers to provide various quantities of electricity at the locations at which they can inject into the grid. And each generator specifies for its tranches, and there are up to 6 tranches for every generation plant, the price at which it's willing to sell at. Those offers are made every half hour for every half hour for 2 days in advance of the actual operation, and they're made up until gate closure. Generators that are not directly connected to the grid, generators which are generally less than 10 megawatts, are in fact not required to make offers. Offers have to be positive or zero, though we can't have negative offers. And gate closure for most generators is 2 hours before the start of the half hour to which an offer relates. A standard generator cannot alter its offer price after gate closure, and it can only alter its offer quantities for a genuine physical reason. For intermittent generators, and that is wind and solar, who really can't predict what their output will be because the sun can come across, can go under a cloud for solar, or for wind, the wind that was blowing can slow down. There is effectively no gate closure, but there are rules about how they offer so that they cannot use that intermittency to effectively game the market and advantage themselves relative to other players. And those rules for the intermittent generations include a requirement that they offer at no more than 1 cent per megawatt hour. That's right, only 1 cent a megawatt, so it's a fraction of a cent a kilowatt hour. Essentially what that says is they have to be a price taker in the market. They cannot be the parties that set the prices except at that very low level. And so they are to allow, and it's a quite simple rule, it has worked out that it's allowed quite effectively intermittent generators, wind and solar, to be integrated quite successfully into the New Zealand market, and we now have wind is running about 6 to 7% of total generation. Those figures I gave before were about in particular islands. The system operator uses a linear program computer model, which would be familiar to some of you, which is called Scheduling, Pricing and Dispatch, or SPD. And what it does is determines what offers will be accepted to meet forecast demand and which generation plants or dispatchable load will be utilised and for what quantities. And the optimisation program has as an objective function the minimisation of the total delivered cost of energy in reserves to consumers. So it takes into account losses from different locations. It also takes into account the costs of reserves, and it takes into account the transmission constraints that are there in the system, and it takes into account all of the security requirements of being able to manage the system as a prudent operator does for a system operator. So reserves can be provided either by generators or in fact by interruptible load. Large or even aggregated small consumers can offer to provide reserves that is offered to be cut off rather than to inject in as a way. And in practice, in fact, interruptible load is a very significant source of reserves in the New Zealand marketplace. We also have markets for black start. That's the situation where the system goes down, you have no power to start a power station normally, but some power stations are able to be started and you piggyback and get the system back up again. We also have markets for frequency keeping, and indeed the HVDC link now has round power ability, that is, can send power in both directions, and we're using that as of quite recently to help maintain frequency and reduce the need for frequency keeping, and creating now a national market for frequency keeping rather than two island markets across it. And we also have underway a market arrangements for providing extended reserves. So that's how we match demand and supply. How do we set the prices? Well, it's a linear programming model, as I said. The shadow prices of it actually in the same model work out the locational marginal price at each injection and each offtake point of the grid. And the price at those reflects the marginal cost or benefit of providing an extra megawatt hour of energy at that particular injection or offtake point. And it does that given the available offers, the transmission losses and constraints that would be incurred if you inject and take off at that particular node. There are approximately 250 nodes for which prices are determined in New Zealand, and they're spread across the two main islands. Generally, the more northerly, that is, the further you are from those relatively cheap, short-run marginal cost hydro stations, and the more remote you are from generation, the higher the price is. And prices can be quite divergent between places, but on average, they're about 10 to 20% difference between the north and the south over the course of a day. And prices vary quite significantly during the day, from the times when you've got peak demand until times when you've got low demand. They can go from a few cents a megawatt hour to a few $100 a megawatt hour. Normally they range between something like $30 and 110, 120 New Zealand dollars, or in US dollars 20 and about 80 during the course of a day, but they can have quite wide variations. And generators are paid on the basis of their long-run marginal price at the location in which they inject, and the offtake customers at the same LMP at the location in which they take electricity from the grid. New Zealand is an energy-only market. We have no capacity payments to generators, and there are many markets where there are payments for capacity. A generator in New Zealand doesn't get paid anything unless they provide energy or ancillary services like frequency keeping or reserves. And if they just are there, they don't get paid anything for having capacity available. Why is that the case? Well, the usual needs for capacity payments in markets are twofold. One is that people, for political reasons, impose an upper cap on the price of electricity. They find it hard to justify to politicians why prices might go very high in an energy-only market. But you need very high prices in an energy-only market to encourage people to keep that reserve capacity to meet those occasions when your plant is only very infrequently run. And if the plant is only infrequently run, it needs a very high price to actually economically sustain it. New Zealand doesn't have a cap. The other reason that it occurs is to promote the construction of particular types of generation, usually renewables. But New Zealand actually has already 84% of its electricity being produced by renewables. That's risen from 65% in the mid-2000s. And we introduced an emissions trading scheme in 2008. It applies to electricity generation, in fact, applies to all gases in all sectors. And it ties the price of carbon to the world price, which has been relatively low most recently. But generators know that it's going to be the world price. It's not a hugely contentious political issue, but they factor that in their investment decisions. And we've been having significant development of renewables at the expense of gas and coal-fired power stations, which are being shut down. New Zealand, there are a couple of interesting bits. New Zealand has that full nodal pricing. There are 250 different prices. There's been a lot of agitation over years for people saying we should move to a fewer number of prices. We should move to zonal prices, and the usual argument they put is it inhibits retail competition. New Zealand has full retail competition. Every consumer can choose what retailer, and we have 27 different retailers among 4.5 million people. But New Zealand also has a long, skinny configuration. It also has this diversity in generation and production. It also has the differences in fuel types, so that the actual differences between nodal prices do signal real economic costs and real economic benefits of consuming or generating at different locations. And for that reason, it has been maintained as a full nodal pricing market. Recently, we introduced financial transmission rights. They are hedges between different locations, and we have an active market for them and for options on financial transmission rights, which is a transmission cost hedge, and that has largely silenced the calls for zonal pricing to replace full nodal pricing. There used to also be claims that large generators were able to manipulate the wholesale and hedge markets to their advantage, usually in dry years when we had hydro scarcity. The Electricity Authority, which I chair and which started operation in 2010, has made a number of changes that have contributed to those complaints declining to the point where they're almost now non-existent. And I've listed what those various changes are. But they have helped shore up through the adjustments in the marketplace confidence that the market is, both for the wholesale and the hedge markets, are reflecting real economics and not the position of certain generators. There was also a rather brave move made in 2011 by the government. It required 2 generators to transfer ownership of hydro resources from one to another to break up the ownership and control of the major river system that contained storage, so that you didn't have one decision maker over it. It was contentious at the time. It's now considered to have been quite an astute move to make. The final bit I want to talk about, the third of those things you need, is how do you pay for transmission. That has been highly contentious in New Zealand since charges for transmission were first separated from charges for electricity in the early 1990s. But New Zealand is not unique in transmission charges being contentious. They're contentious in many jurisdictions. In fact, they're contentious, for example, in the United States. You can find circuit court judges hearing cases where people have disputed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's decisions and so forth. There is usually debate about the total revenue the grid owner should be permitted, because of disagreements about what are the efficient operating costs of a monopoly, because transmission companies tend to be monopoly organisations, and the opportunity cost of the capital utilised in providing the grid. But even if you manage to resolve the issue of the total revenue of the grid operator, there is still the vexed question of how that revenue requirement will be shared among parties, and that gives ample room for debate also. And there is a number of reasons, I believe, why that's the case. Firstly, the economics of setting efficient charges is not easy. The large economies of scale in grid operation means that marginal costs are generally above average costs. You're still on that downward sloping long-run average cost component of the curve. So marginal cost pricing, which people often see as being efficient, will not fully recover the cost of providing grid assets. And a grid owner that's not going to be fully paid is a grid owner that's not going to continue to invest. And that's not in the long-term benefit of consumers or the grid owner, or indeed the government. Estimating what the long-run marginal cost, even if you are wanting to use that as a component of your charges, is of expanding the grid, is talking about things that will happen in the future, and hence requires judgments, and judgments can always be disputed. And when judgments are made by regulators, there is a game of disputing them. Linking grid charges for electricity consumption, linking it to how much people consume or how much they produce, has the effect of altering the allocative efficiency of the consumption and production of electricity. Now what that means is that if you charge somebody and the existing asset there is sunk, you will discourage some people from using it when the asset already exists and they might as well use it at any rate. So you get a allocative inefficiency as a result of just using the linking charges for transmission to consumption. And the usual way of getting and uplifting charges when long-run marginal cost, some of you who are economists will know, is Ramsey pricing, which requires you to charge inversely proportionate to the elasticity of demand. But to do that, you have to know what the elasticity of demand is for various consumer groups for transmission assets. And that's not easy, and judgments are required, and they're debatable when the judgments are being made by regulators. And then there are network effects which provide a challenge to working out who is the actual beneficiary, because most of you will know that electricity sort of flows across the grid, and it's hard to work out exactly what assets are being used at any point in time, and you require models to do it, and they require judgments, and those judgments are open to debate. And then you have the lumpy nature of the optimal scale of investment means that often engineers in particular want to build assets ahead of demand, not to wait until demand requires those assets. So you get the vexed question of who should pay for grid capacity that's in excess of what's currently required. So the services provided by that's one reason, is the economics of transmission charging is not easy. Another reason why transmission charges tend to be disputed is that the services that are provided by them are often not at all well defined. Indeed, engineers, who usually are principal in this, tend to focus on the assets and the provision of the assets rather than on the provision of services, which is what economists tend to naturally think about. Well, I'd be blunt and say consumers don't care at all about assets. They care about the delivery of a service to them. They want low-cost electricity delivered to where they want it, when they want it, and they want it to have the qualities in terms of frequency, reliability and so forth that they wish to consume. And people do have a habit of debating charges for what they are receiving if those what they're receiving is not well matched to what they're paying for. So the charges in transmission tend to be linked to assets, but people who are paying these charges tend to think in terms of services. And so they tend to debate the issue because how are those two related? Especially when they see different services for different people being charged the same or similar to them, even though obviously the costs of providing that extra service is greater. We have an example of that in New Zealand where Auckland has N-2, that is, it can deal with two contingent events simultaneously before it breaks down. It's the major city, the main area of small-scale manufacturing. The rest of the country tends to operate on N-1 or N, that is, has only coverage for one contingency or no contingencies, yet the charges are uniform across the country. The people of Southland don't like seeing the people of Auckland getting something that they're paying for, but they don't share in. Then the transmission is a natural monopoly, I've said, and the grid is often provided by a government-owned entity, and if it's not, it's provided by a regulated entity, usually. And that has several effects. The charges set are often heavily influenced by political decisions and potentially open to effective lobbying by parties. If parties think lobbying may work, then expect lobbying. That's the incentive they've got, and they tend to do it. Another consequence of that monopoly is that those paying for the grid suspect that the monopoly is not productively efficient, is not cost efficient, is wasteful, and they are concerned about paying for inefficient operations. And thirdly, consumers fear that grid investments will be large and occur earlier than economically optimal and be of bigger size, and that's because both regulators, they know, and politicians tend to be risk averse, and they're concerned about paying for that inefficient investment. I've said already that New Zealand has had a number of debates over the years about transmission charges and what are the lessons, because as you move towards integration across boundaries in this region, whether you realise it now or not, you're going to get lots of arguments about who pays for transmission in one form or another. It can start out looking quite simple as it did in New Zealand, but as time goes by it becomes, and major investments are required, it becomes much more of a focus. The first comment I've got is that requiring parties directly connected to the grid to pay the capital and operating costs of the connection is usually not contentious. So that's usually the easy bit, the connected assets, the ones which are required to connect up to the grid. And that's especially so if the grid owner doesn't have a monopoly on providing those assets, parties can use competition to get somebody else to build the connection assets if they need to, subject of course to them meeting the technical requirements. So that's one bit that's not generally contentious. Another bit that's often not contentious, you recall I said New Zealand has a full nodal pricing. And one of the consequences of that is that the outcome of the wholesale market is that you have some excesses that are driven by losses and constraints on the transmission grid, because you are charging locational marginal pricing, which is based on the marginal loss and the marginal cost of a constraint, but the economy only actually faces the averages. And so you get a difference between those, and those are, in fact, often convenient to put an offset against transmission costs. In fact, there's a mathematical theory that goes back to the 1990s which shows that under certain conditions, those loss and constraint excesses should pay for all of the grid. In practice, they don't, because the assumptions behind that mathematics about there being no economies of scale and perfectly divisible grid and not built ahead of demand just don't hold. But using the loss and constraint excesses to pay in part for the transmission costs is usually not consensus, although there are parties who debate which way they should be used. And there are also a couple of ways that can be used for identifying the beneficiaries of specific transmission assets. You recall I doing pricing and dispatch linear programming model for optimization and working out both the prices, locational marginal prices, and which generators will be dispatched at which times to meet demand. Well, one can in fact rerun the optimization holding out a particular group of transmission assets, and by comparing the outcome of what happens with the transmission assets when they're available compared with what happens to prices and quantities when the transmission assets are not available in those mathematical simulations, you can actually work out the effect of those transmission assets on the locational marginal price at every point and on the volumes that come from each point. So you can then work out which generators and which consumers are benefiting from the existence of those transmission assets. And you can use the same mathematical model that is used to solve the allocation of dispatch, the dispatch problem and the pricing problem to do that. And then another method is that often when you go into grid investments for expansion, cost-benefit studies are conducted, and this is a common technique in the US, they give you an idea of who the beneficiaries supposedly are ex ante, before the event, rather than ex post, which the SPD approach does, and that then can be used as a basis of identifying who the beneficiaries are and so forth. But even if you do get working out who the beneficiaries are, converting that from beneficiaries into who should pay and what they should pay is itself open to debate and not easy. One of the matters which has also become much clearer in New Zealand is that the simple approach of what Richard Posner, in a judgment in the US Circuit Court, described as the peanut butter approach. That is, spread the charges as thinly as possible across the toast so that they don't affect too many people too much, but spread them evenly and thinly. That goes well until you start, for the interconnected grid, until you start running into the need for major investments in some areas relative to other areas. And you are ending up spreading the charges across a whole range of people who start saying, we're not beneficiaries of this investment. And we've struck that in New Zealand, where a great deal of investment has had to go into reinforcing the grid going into Auckland, but the rest of the country has not seen any benefit out of that. Indeed, because it's improved the ability to transport electricity to Auckland, has on average raised prices in other areas, marginally, but still raised prices. So they say we're not beneficiaries of this investment. So that the smearing, in New Zealand we call it Vegemite approach, because in America it's peanut butter, but we have a spread in New Zealand that New Zealanders and Australians eat, which is made of yeast and rather, to other people, tastes rather nasty, but is very popular. Vegemite. That approach looks simple, looks okay, until you start getting into the need for major grid expansion that's not even across the regions. And the final point I have is that once the allocation approach has been in place for some time, irrespective of whether it's by accident or by design, you will get parties on both the load side and the generation side who will actually respond to the way the current transmission pricing methodology that you're using operates. And when you attempt to change that, as you will because you have calls for people to change it. For those groups who have made those investments, anything that undermines their investment is highly contentious. So my advice is think long and think hard about transmission charging early on in the piece so that you ensure that it's both dynamically efficient and durable, and because once you've got it in place, changing it is a difficult thing. As one regulator said to me a little while ago, transmission pricing is a regulatory problem that is best left to your successor. With that note, I will conclude and happy to take questions. Yes, down in the front row.
My name is Mike from Vietnam. Thanks for your presentation, and I have a couple of questions on the New Zealand wholesale market. The first question is on the intermittent generator, the wind and the solar. You said that they will be the price taker in the market. So does the market revenue could enough for them to recover all their costs? Because the cost of the wind and solar is, I think that is maybe expensive and maybe higher than the cost of the marginal generator in the market. The second question is on the full node pricing. In general, for the remote area or for the rural area, the market price will maybe higher because it's far from the power station. But in the remote area, the household has low income. They have normally in a remote area, the household will normally poor and cannot be much money to pay the highest price in this case. So that is a situation in our country, but I'm not sure that do the New Zealand has the same problem. But in this case, do you have some kind of arrangement or some kind of subsidy for the remote area? Thank you.
Right. Well, in answer to your first question about wind, the long-run marginal cost of wind is cost competitive in the New Zealand environment. We have no subsidies at all, and indeed the average price in New Zealand is around about 70 New Zealand dollars, which is 54 New Zealand dollars worth about 0.54 of a euro. So at the present time, so it's competitive with international prices, but wind is actually around that. Before I became the regulator 5 years ago, I worked at an economics institute, and I did a lot of the consenting work for some of the generators. I used to also work for the consumers as well, but for the generators. So I know what their marginal costs are, and they are competitive at it. And so we actually still have, without subsidies, wind farms. The most recent generator opened in New Zealand was a wind farm, and it was opened about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I know what its marginal cost of production is, and it's very cost competitive with the wholesale price. So we don't have that issue because we actually get much higher yields out of our wind. And I would be cynical enough to say that not only if politicians entertain lobbying, you could expect lobbying, if regulators entertain subsidies, you can expect the need for subsidies. So that I suspect that in some countries people get wound up a bit as regulators about the need to subsidise some of these. In terms of solar, it isn't relatively cost competitive, and so we actually have relatively little of it because we have no subsidies for it. But there isn't a real environmental reason for solar in New Zealand because 84% is renewables any rate, and solar, you have to pollute the atmosphere to make the solar panel. So why would you want to displace a hydro that already exists with a solar panel just on greenhouse gas bases. So we don't subsidise those, and at the moment we're making sure that solar will pay their proper distribution component by ensuring that the distribution charges aren't all linked just to the energy that goes in. So New Zealand's circumstances are a bit different than other countries in terms of the wind resource we have, and we've had a long tradition of no subsidies. Indeed, our regulatory statutory objective would make it impossible for us to introduce subsidies. Because we're required to promote efficiency, we're required to promote competition. And subsidising one form of fuel won't do it. In terms of the energy, well, first issue in New Zealand that's a bit different is that our farmers are basically commercial operators. We have no subsidies on farming whatsoever. We did away with those in the 1980s. And farm incomes are relatively high. Indeed, rural area incomes are higher in many instances. So the main city in New Zealand, Auckland, actually doesn't have the highest average incomes. Highest average incomes are actually in the capital, Wellington, where I live, where it's the bureaucrats. But apart from that, it's other areas where there are rural bases. That's the first point. The second point is that it's in the rural areas that much of the renewable resource exists, like the hydro lakes, the rivers, and the geothermal plants. So they're actually located closer to so they actually win out of at least that locational transmission pricing. There are a couple of areas in New Zealand. One is in the very north, right up above Auckland, which is relatively low income and a long way from any real transmission and really any real generation. And the other is on the west coast, where they have a lot of local generation, but it's very small scale and they're quite isolated too. And they're not about energy, but there are issues around transmission charges in relation to those areas. But New Zealand's approach is run the electricity market for efficiency overall and deal with income and energy access problems by other means that directly target the people who have low incomes. If you target electricity prices, then rich people who consume a lot more electricity win a lot more than the poor people whom you're trying to help. So that's our approach. Does that deal with your person behind?
Thank you. My question concerning on interruptible load. I saw your note written that interruptible load is an important source of reserve. I have three questions on this. The first one is who use interruptible load? Second, how many % of customers using such kind of load? And the third one is what incentive do they get by applying this interruptible load? Thank you.
Well, the sort of parties that provide interruptible load is firstly you can have some major electricity consumers, such as people who process pulp and paper and make paper, or people who process dairy products, who often have backup plants themselves, and they will voluntarily be disconnected and offer interruptible load for which they bid into the market and they get paid for the value of the service that they provide as a result of that. So they actually get the reserve price for being interrupted. So there's that group. Then there is a lot of distributors have ripple control, which is an old technology, on hot water cylinders. And a lot of New Zealand houses have electric hot water heaters. And they can actually disconnect those hot water cylinders. But we are starting to get actually using smart meters, the possibilities of other technologies coming into that market, and we have parties who are actively looking at it. So it's large industrials and then distributors are using other activities. We also have residential retail customers who pay the wholesale market price to their retailer. So they take the half-hour price, the ups and the downs, and some of them are quite active in switching to gas or turning the washing machine off or whatever if prices in a more sustained way are starting to get high. So that's growing quite rapidly. They pay a management fee, but they're on the wholesale price. I'm afraid that's the time I've been allotted. The time up symbol has gone up, so thank you very much for listening to my presentation.